Bom dia. Nós estamos hoje no último dia do Congresso. Vamos encerrar com a terceira palestra magistral, a cargo do professor Deepak Nayyar, que vem da Índia. Me cabe apresentá-lo e eu não sei nem por onde começar. O professor Nayyar tem um longo, talvez seja melhor dizer densa carreira acadêmica, que começou talvez em Oxford, onde ele se formou e da qual a Universidade de Oxford, na Inglaterra, ele foi professor. Depois ele foi professor em Sussex. Depois ele volta para a Índia, ele foi professor do Indian Institute of Management de Calcutá, ele foi reitor da Universidade de Delhi, ele hoje em dia é professor emérito da Universidade de Nehru em Delhi. Ele foi ou é do conselho de vários organismos ligados ao desenvolvimento, entre eles eu salientaria o AIDA de Helsinki e o South Center de Genebra, e ele, nos últimos anos, passou uma grande parte do ano como professor visitante da New School of Social Research de Nova York. Bem, tudo isso já seria bastante, mas acho que ainda é pouco que chama atenção na carreira do professor. Enfim, o que eu gostaria de destacar e que vai nos aproximar da palestra dele, que é sobre globalização e democracia, é que ele fez parte da Comissão Mundial da Dimensão Social da Globalização. Eu acho que aí a gente começa a se aproximar um pouco do perfil do Deepak Nayyar, porque ele faz parte dos economistas de quem a gente gosta, digamos assim. Vocês estão rindo? Nós temos certas preferências aqui no Centro Celso Furtado. Quem estava aqui faz 2 dias, quando eu abri Saturnino, eu e Luciano, quando nós falamos aquelas palavras de saudação a vocês, nós falamos, e eu insisti um pouco nos economistas que transgridem as fronteiras e as molduras da própria economia, que vão muito além delas, e o professor Deepak Nayyar é tipicamente alguém dessa turma. Eu ajudei a editar um livro dele no Brasil, que é a última obra dele, que saiu ano passado pela Oxford University Press, e que nós editamos este ano, que acaba de sair, que é esta aqui, um breve comercial, a Corrida pelo Crescimento. E numa das trocas de e-mail que eu tive com ele para a edição deste livro, que acabou de sair pela Contraponto, numa coleção do Centro Celso Furtado, chamada Economia, Política e Desenvolvimento, exatamente nós falamos sobre isso, sobre esses economistas que sabem ser muito mais pluridisciplinares do que ficar na própria economia, e o professor Nayyar me mandou um e-mail dizendo que ele, exatamente, eu vou ler o e-mail dele, que é muito significativo quando eu digo que ele é um dos nossos, digamos assim. E ele diz nesse e-mail que é mais que tempo para os economistas de pensar muito além dos limites da própria disciplina e integrar no seu pensamento a filosofia, a história e a política. E, aliás, diz ele, foi assim que a economia começou sua vida, refletindo a filosofia moral de Adam Smith. E diz ele, finalizando, que poucos de nós tentamos esse caminho e ao custo de sermos excluídos do mainstream. Mas, graças a Deus, professor Deepak, o senhor tentou, o senhor conseguiu, portanto, seja bem-vindo entre nós e venha falar de globalização e democracia. Muito obrigada.
Thank you, Chair, for those generous words of welcome. Distinguished colleagues, distinguished guests, I consider it an honor and a privilege to be in your midst this morning. I must say that I do enjoy coming to Brazil. There is an intellectual tradition, but there is much more than that. This morning, I'm going to talk about globalization and democracy in a way that would be a complement to what Jose Antonio Ocampo said, but very, very different in terms of approach. The gathering momentum of globalization during the last quarter of the 20th century and the first decade of the 21st century has coincided with the spread of political democracy across the world. Economies have become global, but politics remains national. For economists, globalization refers to the expansion of economic transactions and the organization of economic activities across political boundaries of nation-states. More precisely, it can be defined as a process associated with increasing economic openness, growing economic interdependence, and deepening economic integration in the world economy. But globalization is a multidimensional phenomenon. Its implications and consequences are not confined to the economy alone, but extend to polity and society. There can be little doubt that the whole is different from, if not greater than, the sum total of the parts. This epoch of globalization has also witnessed the spread of political democracy across countries in the developing world and in transition economies. Such democratic politics is mostly about electoral democracy in some form, even if people do not always have the political rights or the political freedoms that democracies should ensure for their citizens. Nevertheless, it represents a vast change from the authoritarian regimes that characterized the developing world until 3 decades ago. The geographical spread of democracy is striking across Asia, Latin America, and Africa. Of course, elections are not always free and fair, and it is not as if authoritarian regimes have vanished. There are many that exist. Some are entrenched, and some are under siege. In a large number of countries, these countries, however, dictatorial regimes are subject to increasing question as aspirations for democracy rise everywhere. In this lecture, I will explore the relationship between globalization and democracy. I will begin with the simple analytical construct derived from economics that suggests trade-offs between globalization, the nation-state, and democratic politics. In reality, of course, the relationship is neither linear nor characterized by structural rigidities. I will then analyze the relationship between market economy and political democracy in a national context to show that it is interactive, so that such an approach is useful for an understanding of the international context. It leads to a discussion of how globalization might constrain degrees of freedom for nation-states and space for democratic politics. But this provides an incomplete picture, because I am coming to the conclusion that the causation runs in both directions. The essential next step would be to consider whether political democracy within countries might exercise some checks and balances on markets and globalizations, which could also provide a closure. In sum, my argument is that the relationship between globalization and democracy is dialectical, and that it does not conform to ideological caricatures, some of which I also believed in. It is possible to consider the relationship between the process of globalization in the world economy with political democracy in nation states in terms of a very simple analytical construct, which is the standard trilemma from open economy macroeconomics. And in this, I start with, and then we'll critically evaluate Danny Roderick's work. Now, this is at best, I think, a starting point because it does not quite recognize the complexity, let alone the dialectics of the relationship. The original dilemma argues that it is not possible for countries to maintain simultaneously independent monetary policies, fixed exchange rates, and open capital accounts. This open economy trilemma is sometimes described in macroeconomics as the impossible trinity because it is possible to maintain only two of the three. If an economy chooses capital mobility and fixed exchange rates, it must give up autonomy in monetary policy. If an economy wants fixed exchange rates and autonomy in monetary policy, it must do without capital mobility. If an economy wishes to have autonomy in monetary policy with capital mobility, it cannot have fixed exchange rates. Now, these possible alternatives are in fact observable in the world economy at different points in time. From the late 19th century until the Great Depression, the gold standard combined fixed exchange rates with capital mobility, but countries sacrificed monetary policy autonomy. From the mid-40s to the early 70s, the gold exchange standard created at Bretton Woods combined fixed exchange rates with monetary policy autonomy, but more or less ruled out capital mobility. In the period since the mid-70s until now, the present era of globalization, most countries sought to combine monetary policy autonomy with capital mobility, abandoning fixed exchange rates for a regime of floating exchange rates. Now, this derived construct is described by Danny Roderick as the political trilemma of the world economy. The three nodes of this derivative are globalization, the nation-state, and democratic politics. In this characterization, globalization describes a substantial integration of national economies into the world economy. The nation-state refers to the sovereign jurisdiction in terms of laws and institutions, while democratic politics is about electoral democracy, political freedoms, and political mobilization. As in the original dilemma, Roderick argues it is possible to sustain only two of the three. If a country wants to stay with the nation-state and democratic politics, it cannot sustain deep international economic integration. If a country wants to combine globalization with the nation-state, it needs to sacrifice democratic politics. If a country wishes to have democratic politics in a world of globalization, it would have to do without the nation-state, Roderick argues. Now, the underlying reasons are not obvious. The essence of the Roderick hypothesis is that deeply integrated national economies would conflict with regulatory and jurisdictional discontinuities created by heterogeneous national laws and institutions, while harmonized laws and institutions that eliminate the significance of national borders conflict with the foundations of democratic politics, where governments are accountable to people. The basic idea is also illustrated with a caricature description of the reality in the past. The argument that Roderick puts forward runs as follows. From the late 1940s to the mid-70s, the golden age of capitalism, the multilateral economic system made it possible for countries to stay with the nation-state and democratic politics by limiting the degree of international economic integration. From the late 1970s until the late 2000s, the age of globalization, which sought to harmonize policies, institutions, and laws across countries, made it possible for countries to combine globalization with the nation-state, but at the expense of democratic politics. In this construct, it is conceivable to contemplate a future, however unlikely, where it may be possible for countries to combine democratic politics with globalization by dispensing with the nation-state and opting for a world government or global federalism. Now, the second lane in the chain of this hypothesis is also stressed by Thomas Friedman. the celebrated journalist in New York Times, from a somewhat different ideological perspective, who uses the golden straitjacket as a phrase to describe how governments everywhere in this age of globalization compete with each other to harmonize policies and earn the confidence of international firms and international markets. The following quotation is so explicit that the phrase needs no further explanation. I quote Thomas Friedman, "As your country puts on the golden straitjacket, two things tend to happen. Your economy grows and your politics shrinks. It narrows the political and economic policy choices of those in power so that it is increasingly difficult to find any real differences between ruling and opposition parties. Political choices get reduced to slight nuances, to Pepsi and Coke, but never to any major derivation from or deviation from the core golden rules. Yet the reality is that there has been an expansion of, rather than a contraction in political democracy during the very era that Friedman describes and analyzes and that Danny Roderick contemplates. In my view, this caricature characterization does not capture the complexity of reality. The golden age of capitalism witnessed a rapid liberalization of international trade and international investment to provide the foundations of globalization, even if restrictions on capital mobility meant that it did not extend to international finance. What is more, the age of globalization since 1980 witnessed a spread rather than a sacrifice of democratic politics across countries, even if the rise of political democracy was uneven and incomplete. And this move towards greater democracy in a world of globalization was not attributable to any governance of the world economy in terms of institutions and rules, let alone a world government. But that is not all. The major industrialized countries, not only the United States, but also countries such as Britain, France, Germany, and Japan, are able to combine the nation state and democratic politics with globalization. But for some deference to international financial markets, surely this diminishes the explanatory power, if not the validity, of the Roderick-Friedman hypothesis. Now, apart from such reality checks, there are two basic problems with the trilemma as an analytical concept. For one, it depicts a caricature world with strong rigidities. For another, it creates a binary world with either or choices. Hence, if there are three possibilities, it is possible, people argue, to attain only two of the three at a time. It is at best an analytical abstraction that highlights conflicts or trade-offs between three stipulated objectives, and it is not quite appropriate even in the limited context of open economy, macroeconomics, which is what I do much of the time, where it is simply an analytical construct that highlights conflicts between policy objectives or policy instruments to focus on dilemmas that arise rather than a depiction of reality. There is, however, an even more serious problem of transitivity in moving from economics in the original trilemma to politics in the derived trilemma. Each of these three nodes, international economic integration, the nation state, or democratic politics, may represent a range rather than a single unique point, which means that there may be choices within each. Moreover, trade-offs may be a continuum rather than binary choices, which means that it may be possible to have more of two and less of the third. In other words, there could be more choices within and between the three nodes, whereas the trilemma allows choosing only two from three. The fundamental problem with this as an analytical construct is that it suggests a false precision, which is deceptive if not misleading. Of course, in reality, there are conflicts between objectives or desired states, and hence wherever there are conflicts, there are bound to be trade-off. Hence, there will be choices to be made. But these should not be reduced to, as Danny Roderick does, pick two, any two. In this context, there is something to learn from history. Globalization in the late 20th century and early 21st century, as much as the earlier era of globalization during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, represents neither the end of history nor the end of geography. It is not the end of history now as it was not then, because markets and globalization may not be the dominant mode for the world economy in perpetuity. It may have been a world war then, and it is an economic crisis now that creates doubt about the wisdom and necessity of deepening economic integration in the world economy. And there was life after globalization then, as there will be now. It is not the end of geography, because nation-states cannot exist in a vacuum and must strive to improve the economic conditions of their people, to whom governments are accountable. It is clear, at least to me, that the nation-state is a reality that has not withered away. There has been erosion in its economic space, but not quite in its political space. This reality has been brought home by the global economic crisis. At the same time, democratic politics is an aspiration that is on the rise everywhere. The spread of political democracy has coincided in time with the advent of market economy. There are fewer authoritarian regimes and more democratic regimes. In sum, the nation-state is a reality embedded in history that has emerged stronger from the global economic crisis. Democratic politics, which has gathered both momentum and strength in the recent past, is increasingly a prior, as there is a rights consciousness among citizens. In contrast, the degree of international economic integration is a matter of strategic choice in terms of speed, sequence, and engagement. It depends on choices made by the nation-state, where ultimately governments can decide only in accordance with preferences of people. And if it produces unequal outcomes, globalization could become unsustainable in terms of both economics and politics. Let me turn to the nature of the relationship between market economy and political democracy in a national context. That is the most appropriate starting point for an understanding of the relationship between globalization and democracy situated in the international context. The causation is interactive as it runs in both directions, and the relationship is dialectical as one shapes the other. The essence of the tension between the economics of markets and the politics of democracy must be recognized. In a market economy, people vote with their money in the marketplace. The underlying principle is one real, one vote. But a political democracy works on the basis of one person, one vote. The distribution of votes, unlike the distribution of income or assets, is equal. One adult has one vote in politics, even though a rich person has more votes than a poor person in terms of purchasing power in the market. The tension may be compounded by a related asymmetry between economy and polity. The people who are excluded by the economics of markets are included by the politics of democracy. Hence, exclusion and inclusion are asymmetrical in economics and politics. The distribution of capabilities is also uneven in economic and political spheres. The rich dominate a market economy in terms of purchasing power, but the poor have a strong voice in political democracy in terms of votes. And there is a mismatch. It is not surprising then that successive generations of economic thinkers and social philosophers have stressed the role of the state in this process of mediation. The reason is important, even if it is not obvious. Governments are accountable to their people, whereas markets are not. In a democracy, of course, governments are elected by people. But even where they are not, the state needs legitimization from the people, most of whom are not rich or are poor. This task of mediation and reconciliation is difficult but necessary. Markets are responsive to the demands of rich people and not to the needs of poor people. This is inherent in the logic of markets, where decisions about what is produced are based on demand and not a need. Thus, markets produce goods for which there is enough purchasing power. The output mix depends upon the composition of expenditure and the size of the market. Since the rich have more purchasing power, markets left to themselves are likely to produce more soft drinks and not safer drinking water. In this manner, markets include people with entitlements but exclude people without entitlements. In theory, every economic agent, Milton Friedman argued, has the freedom to choose. In practice, there is a choice for some, but not for others. And there is more choice for some than for others. Democracies are more responsive to people with a voice than to people at large. People without a political voice are often simply neglected. There are, of course, problems associated with majority rule, which might lead to some democracies to exclude, if not tyrannize, minorities. Even if we abstract from such problems, however, the principle of one person, one vote does not make every citizen equal in a political democracy. For in the real world, social and economic inequalities are inevitably reflected in the political process. In theory, democracy provides every citizen political freedom in the form of civil rights and political liberties. In practice, there is freedom for some, but not for others, and there is more freedom for some than for others. Clearly, there is an overlap between those excluded by market economy and those excluded by political democracy, just as there is an overlap between those included by market economy and those included by political democracy. The poor who are marginalized in the economy also do not have a voice in the polity, just as the rich who are dominant in the economy also have a strong political voice. Economic deprivation and political marginalization then go hand in hand in much the same way as economic strength and political power go hand in hand. But it needs to be recognized that the liberal paradox runs much deeper than what I suggest. On the one hand, markets exclude people without entitlements or assets. It is in the logic of markets. Yet markets would like to include as many people as possible. For in the words of Adam Smith, the division of labor is limited by the size of the market. On the other hand, democracy includes people by a constitutional right to vote. It is the foundation of democracy. Yet, political processes seek to exclude or to marginalize those without a voice. That is what the pursuit and exercise of political power is about. Now, the irony of this paradoxical situation is striking. Indeed, this twist in the tale further highlights the dialectics of the interaction between market economy and political democracy. This dialectical relationship between markets and democracy, as also the interaction between economics and politics, becomes more complex when globalized economies are juxtaposed with national politics. However, the essential tensions, asymmetries, overlaps, and paradoxes remain similar. The dialectical relationship also remains. Even so, two questions arise. First, how does a market economy, which is more global than local, influence national politics differently? Second, how does political democracy influence a globalized market economy differently when compared with the national market economy that is much less integrated with the outside world? Now, I will attempt to answer these two questions. Globalization has indeed reduced degrees of freedom for nation states in the economic sphere, which is so essential for countries that are latecomers to development. Indeed, the space for an autonomy to formulate policies in the pursuit of national development objectives is significantly diminished. This is so for two reasons: unfair rules of the game and in the world economy, and consequences of integration into international financial markets. Now, in a world of unequal partners, it is not surprising that the rules of the game are asymmetrical in terms of construct and inequitable in terms of outcome. The strong have the power to make the rules and the authority to implement the rules. In contrast, the weak can neither set nor invoke the rules. The problem, however, takes different forms. First, there are different rules in different spheres. The rules of the game for the international trading system being progressively set in the WTO illustrate this with clarity. There are striking asymmetries. National boundaries should not matter for trade flows and capital flows, but should be clearly demarcated for technology flows and labor flows. Second, there are rules for some, but not for others. The conditions imposed by the IMF and the World Bank provide the most obvious example. There are no rules for surplus countries, but the Bretton Woods twins set rules for borrowers in the developing world and in transition economies. Third, the agenda for new rules is partisan. There is an attempt on the part of industrialized countries to create new multilateral agreements in the WTO in many spheres, essentially because it incorporates an enforcement mechanism which provides a legal right to retaliate. But this is not the agenda of developing countries. In sum, this regime, which appears rule-based, is a regime in which rules are not uniform. And it is not clear how or why that is better than discretion. Taken together, such rules and conditions inevitably curb the use of industrial policy, technology policy, trade policy, and financial policy as strategic forms of intervention to foster industrialization. At the same time, the consequences of integration into international capital markets also reduce degrees of freedom. Exchange rates can no longer be used as a strategic device to provide an entry into the world market for manufactured goods, just as interest rates can no longer be used as a strategic instrument to guide the allocation of scarce investable resources in the market economy. What is more, countries that are integrated into the international financial system are constrained in using an autonomous management of demand to maintain levels of output and employment. Expansionary fiscal and monetary policies, large government deficits to stimulate aggregate demand, or low interest rates to encourage domestic investment can no longer be used because of an overwhelming fear that such measures could lead to speculative capital flight and ultimately a run on the national currency. What is more, the gathering momentum of globalization associated with an internationalization of financial markets has led to the formulation of a rationale for orthodox macroeconomic policies that is almost prescriptive. The objectives of price stability and fiscal balance have become sacrosanct, which defines the role of monetary policy and fiscal policy in the narrowest possible sense. Slowly but surely, this orthodoxy has also come to be embedded in the belief system of individuals who influence policy and shape opinion in politics and in government. In this process, intellectuals from the world of academia provide the rationale, and editors and columnists from the world of media provide the voice. It is no surprise that the orthodox belief system has transformed into a virtual ideology. This ideology is not abstract. It is embedded in institutions, both national and international. International financial markets think of price stability almost as an article of faith. High interest rates to ensure profitability and strong exchange rates to impart confidence. Orthodox macroeconomic policies are simply means to these ends. The same view is adopted by the multilateral financial institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, which exercise enormous influence on economies in crisis. Now, it is only natural that such thinking is an integral part now of national institutions, even outside the world of finance. The advocacy may come from domestic financial sectors, but policies are formulated by finance ministries, while practices are adopted by central banks. In sum, the existing global rules encroach upon essential policy space, and the problem is compounded by the rapid, sometimes premature integration into international financial markets. It is no surprise that these attributes of globalization also diminish space for democratic politics. This happens for at least three reasons. First, global rules and financial markets in the outside world exercise a significant influence on what governments can or cannot do in terms of fiscal policy, monetary policy, trade policy, industrial policy, and, as Professor Bressa Pereira often argues, exchange rate policy, in the pursuit of national objectives, so that economic decisions are not always shaped by the interests of their citizens. Second, the accountability, if not loyalty, of governments is divided and extends beyond national borders to multilateral rules, transnational corporations, and international financial markets. Indeed, for economies that are vulnerable, even credit rating agencies, Moody's or Standard & Poor, become larger than life. Third, the accountability of governments to their people who elect them or whom they represent is eroded. In an ideal world, accountability to citizens alone is a prior. Now, it is clear that markets and globalization reduce economic policy space for nation states. There is also a reduction, not quite as much, in political space. Even so, there is some dilution of democratic politics in terms of objectives pursued by governments and their accountability to people. Is it possible? It is possible that political democracy within nation states could provide checks and balances vis-a-vis markets and globalization. Now, this is something I had not thought about until recently, but I believe this is a natural question that arises, yet it is seldom addressed. Economics provides a critical yet limited perspective on globalization, a multidimensional phenomenon, the consequences of which extend much beyond the economic to the political, social, and cultural. And it would be no exaggeration to state that the whole is different from the sum total of the parts. Obviously, I cannot enter into a digression in every dimension here, but it is essential to focus on some aspects of political implications to highlight the dialectical nature of the relationship between globalization and democracy. It seems to me that globalization has created two worlds that coexist in space, even if they are far apart in well-being. For some, in a world more interconnected than ever before, globalization has opened the door to many benefits. Open economies and open societies are conducive to innovation, entrepreneurship, and wealth creation. For many, the fundamental problems of poverty, unemployment, and inequality persist. Of course, these problems existed even earlier, but globalization may have accentuated exclusion and deprivation, for it has dislocated traditional livelihoods. The people who reap the benefits and capture the opportunities are included. Some are winners. Economic prosperity does translate into political empowerment, with voice and influence, creating political constituencies for markets and globalization. It is ironical that this process also creates a crisis of identity, particularly for the elite, who believe they have more in common with the global rich and less in common with their less privileged fellow citizens. The outcome might be a secession of the successful, a la Robert Reich. But there are others from an aspiring middle class that benefits from globalization who do not have such an identity crisis and are more empowered in the political process as national citizens. The people who bear the costs and face the risks are marginalized, if not excluded. Some are losers. The visible yet unattainable islands of prosperity provide a sharp contrast with the sea of deprivation in which they live. Their search for identities, whether social, ethnic, or religious, is an inevitable consequence of exclusion, and its assertion lends meaning to their lives. But it is also a means of acquiring collective voice that is audible in a political process. The object is to combat exclusion through social resistance or political protest. In some countries, this is supported, if not reinforced, by organizations or even citizens from civil society that are an increasingly vibrant part of political democracy. Now, globalization is driven by market forces, whether the lure of profit or the threat of competition, and technical progress, which has dismantled geographical barriers of distance in terms of both time and costs. The synthesis of communications technology, which is concerned with the transmission of information, and computer technology, which is concerned with the processing of information, has created information technology which is remarkable in both reach and speed. The consequences of this technological revolution are far-reaching in every sphere. The most visible manifestation among people is mobile telephones. An exponential growth in the number of telephones in the poorest countries has been combined with a phenomenal spread across the world. And this is something that extends to poor countries and poor people at a surprising pace. Now, in itself, through connectivity alone, this revolution in communications has fostered economic, social, and political empowerment. At the same time, access to the internet has expanded at a scorching pace, which has imparted social media software, Facebook, Twitter, and the like, a fantastic reach. This has empowered the aspiring middle class in the political domain everywhere, not only in articulating collective voice, but also in mobilization through networking. More information on economy and polity has created a milieu that is conducive to greater sensitivity about social realities. In such a context, easier and better methods of communication have enhanced awareness of rights and of identities, just as they have enhanced awareness of widening disparities, of relative deprivation. Taken together, these developments have created a much greater rights consciousness among citizens. In countries where social and economic inequalities are high, or rising, or both, there is a juxtaposition of deprivation with aspiration. The widespread access to communications technology just through mobile phones with the rudimentary SMS has enabled social movements to mobilize opinion. This manifestation of the technological revolution, which is among the critical factors driving globalization, has consequences for politics. For one, it broadens and could strengthen political democracy everywhere. But it is particularly important in the developing world, where elections, even if free and fair, do not ensure freedoms and rights for citizens. The arena of politics is often preserved for established political parties or insiders by barriers to entry, whether money or kinship, and these are formidable. And political mobilization is a difficult task for those who are outside the system. This is so for political parties that are new entrants. It is even more difficult for individuals who are concerned or dissenting citizens. In such situations, access to information and ability to communicate empowers citizens in terms of voice, if not influence, to demand their freedoms or to claim their rights. Social movements and social media together can reinforce this process through mobilization of opinion on issues of concern to citizens and society. It is plausible to argue that these processes might provide more effective checks and balances in what are sometimes choiceless democracies. For another, and that's the second dimension, this sequence of developments questions and could weaken authoritarian governments everywhere. It is plausible to argue that this is far more effective in challenging authoritarian regimes than popular movements of citizens were in the past. The process is much less visible and much less susceptible to control. It is able to reach out across geographical space and create coalitions of the willing. That was simply not possible 10 years ago. Thus, mobilization is far more effective. The speed at which dissent or opinion can be mobilized against dictatorships could not have been imagined even a decade ago. The Arab Spring or the Jasmine Revolution provides a powerful example, as dictatorial regimes were ousted by people, although ultimate outcomes turned out to be very different in Tunisia and Egypt, while similar processes were aborted by outside intervention in Libya or Bahrain. Even without regime change, such empowerment of citizens through information and communication creates space for political dissent by people. This is discernible in several countries across the world, whether Greece or Cyprus, where people sought to resist elected governments on policies that had been dictated by the IMF and the European Union in the wake of the financial crisis. Or China and Iran, where authoritarian governments allow little room for dissent on the part of citizens. It is important to stress that the broadening or strengthening of political democracy and the questioning or weakening of authoritarian regimes comes not only from the aspiring middle class, but also from those marginalized or deprived by markets and globalization. Both sets of citizens are empowered by information and communication technologies that have reached ordinary people. Of course, the significance of the aspiring middle class is more audible, more visible, but the poor and the deprived are no longer reconciled to a quiet acceptance of their fates, which was almost the norm earlier, as this new empowerment provides them with a voice to protest and to mobilize for seeking a better world. The argument I have developed here suggests two hypotheses. These are intuitively plausible, even if difficult to prove, and highlight the dialectical nature of the relationship between globalization and democracy. First, the broadening, if not strengthening, of political democracy, where such democracy already exists, attributable to technologies that provide citizens access to information and ability to communicate, helps reclaim some accountability of governments to their people that has been eroded or diminished by markets and globalization. Similarly, the questioning, if not weakening, of authoritarian regimes where democracy does not exist through the same technologies also helps restore or create some accountability of governments to their people. Because in a globalized world where citizens are conscious of reality in other countries, even authoritarian regimes are ultimately accountable, if only to sustain themselves. Second, technologies associated with globalization that empower citizens through a spread of information and means of communication are conducive to political mobilization on issues when the consequences of markets and globalization cross thresholds of tolerance in countries where democracy exists in some form. In effect, then, such empowerment of people provides checks and balances that work through a democratic political process to impose curbs and introduce correctives. Similarly, in countries with authoritarian regimes, citizens empowered with much greater access to information and communication are able to articulate political voice on issues where they are hurt by outcomes that can be linked to markets and globalization. Once this voice is audible, such governments too might become more responsive to concerns of people. Even undemocratic regimes might intervene to correct the situation if some checks and balances kick in. The Latin American experience during the 2000s provides some validation of my hypothesis about the dialectical relationship between globalization and democracy. Most countries in this continent embraced markets and globalization starting around 1980. Some, such as Chile, did so with enthusiasm, while others, such as Argentina or Brazil, did so under duress, driven by the IMF and the World Bank or by international financial markets. The outcome was the lost decade during the 1980s, when growth was stifled and per capita income declined. This hurt people, particularly the poor. The 1990s witnessed a slow recovery, but most economies in Latin America at the turn of the century were roughly where they were 2 decades earlier. In the perception of people, these lost decades were attributed to the negative consequences of markets and globalization. In this context, access to information and means of communication provided to people by technologies associated with markets and globalization did broaden and strengthen political democracy in countries where it existed, just as it did question and weaken authoritarian regimes in countries that were not democratic. The outcome was not just a resurrection of political democracy, but the election of social democratic parties and left-of-center governments in several Latin American countries. And during the 2000s, most of these governments, responsive to the concerns of people, sought to address problems of poverty and inequality through economic policies with a focus on social sectors. These efforts led to progress in terms of human development through educational opportunities, which created capabilities, and public health, which improved the well-being of people, even if there was not enough employment creation. In conclusion, and I will be just 2 minutes, I would like to emphasize that the relationship between globalization and democracy does not conform to ideological caricatures, some of which I also believed in not so long ago. It is neither linear nor unidirectional. In fact, the relationship between market economy and political democracy in a national context is mirrored in the relationship between globalization and democracy in the international context. These relationships are dialectical. The causation runs in both directions in different spheres. And there is an interaction between economics and politics closely intertwined that shapes outcomes. In this lecture, I have explored what globalization and democracy mean for each other, but it is no more than a modest beginning. There are some questions that need asking, just as there are other questions that need answers. It is time, I think, to reflect further on the consequences of globalization, not only for the economy, but also for polity and society. It is also time to rethink how political change might occur within countries in the future as compared with the past. Thank you.